Ultra. So it was occult knowledge. Then, decades later, before the boom of all this technology was upon us.
If you look at a world where we have these chips that are connected to the internet, all of a sudden, every piece of information on the internet becomes accessible to our minds.
Before 9/11 happened, which would justify the putting in of a lot of this survey to talk about how our user data online, everything we buy, everyone we interact with, every opinion we share, every time we click like on something, this creates a codified version of ourselves.
When we use contemporary technology, a trail of information is created in the form of data. When analyzed, it describes our actions, decisions, preferences, movement, and relationships. This codified version of who we are becomes ever more complex, developing, changing, and deforming based on our actions. In this regard, this ledger of our data may be considered a Lamarckian epigenome, a constantly evolving representation of who we are.
A coded version of ourselves that creates basically this ledger, a constantly evolving digital version of ourselves. But it isn't just that they have this thing. The narrator of the video goes on to say that this ledger of ourselves can actually be directed toward a goal.
What if the ledger could be given a volitional purpose rather than simply acting as an historical reference? What if we focused on creating a richer ledger by introducing more sources of information? What if we thought of ourselves not as the owners of this information, but as custodians, transient carriers, or caretakers?
And then they break it up into these parts. Part 1 is an Italian phrase that I will likely butcher, but what it means is talking cricket. So part 1 is basically Jiminy Cricket. So part 1 is your conscience.
Initially, the notion of a goal-oriented ledger may be user-driven. As an organization, Google would be responsible for offering suitable targets for a user's ledger. Whilst the notion of a global good is problematic, topics would likely focus on health or environmental impact to reflect Google's values as an organization. Once the user selects a volition for their ledger, every interaction may be compared to a series of parallel options. If one of these options allows the ledger to move closer to its goal, it will be offered up to the user. Over time, by selecting these options, the user's behavior may be modified and the ledger moves closer to its target.
The narrator goes on to say, initially, this process will be user-driven.
Initially, the notion of a goal-oriented ledger may be user-driven.
But I feel like that bears repeating, that he said initially. Initially, it's user-driven, which by virtue of the fact that he says initially suggests that at some point it won't be user-driven. And so your options will still reflect Google's values, not necessarily the user's values, mind you. A person can choose a goal within the given parameters of Google's values, and the technology on the phone will then use every available bit of data to steer a person towards whatever that goal is. A process that over time will likely become so constant and so seamlessly integrated with all of the person's shopping and communication, social interactions with their phone, places they go, things that they do, etc., that the person's probably not even going to notice anymore that their behavior is now being continuously modified through the feedback loop of this technology. Cybernetics, as coined by Norbert Wiener back in the late 40s, was about communication and control in the animal and the machine. And it requires a feedback loop. So for this behavior modification feedback loop system to work, it's going to require more and more data to continuously modify the person's behavior.